everyone. We're batting cleanup here, but it's going to be a great conversation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks, so thank you.
Same here. Thank you for having me.
I love to begin at the beginning. So you first joined TFA as a core member when you were how old?
22 years old, right out of college, yeah.
So paint that scene for me. Take me back to the interview. What were the key questions that you were asked? Do you remember how you answered them?
Gosh, I don't know if I remember how I answered them, but I was at the time in school in Indiana, and my interview was in Chicago. And so I had never been to Chicago before. I remember I tore my stockings on the way to the interview, which is a great way to start and getting there a little frazzled. But so there are a few parts of the interview process that actually still are pretty consistent. First, you have to do a sample teaching in 5 minutes. And so we actually want you to teach a lesson in 5 minutes, and that was the most nerve-wracking part because you're in front of the audience. And at the time, I was a 1998 core member. The selectors would actually act like students, which was really unhelpful, and would ask, you know, the people there, my fellow peers, could also act as students. And we have mellowed that down because it turns out to be not that helpful in showing and what you learn from me. But after that, we then had a group discussion. And so we had a topic and a scenario that was presented of a school setting, and you would have to have a discussion as a group on what do you think are the solutions? What do you think is going on here? What might you do? And we're trying to get at how people interact with each other, your own critical thinking and ability to engage in a group discussion. There's a writing sample, and then there's a one-on-one interview. And on the one-on-one interview, I remember the question of probing on like quitting. What would have to be true for you to quit and convince me that you wouldn't quit was one that really stands out. A lot about my own experience as a leader and wanting to show that I had demonstrated leadership. What was the hardest thing I had overcome to date? And all these things are obviously trying to get at past behaviors, the best predictor of future behavior. And as we're trying to sort out through some of the competencies and mindsets we're looking for, that's how we go.
And can I ask, how did you answer that question of what was the hardest thing you had to overcome at that age?
The hardest thing that I had to overcome at that age was moving from the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, which is where I'm from. So I grew up right on the Texas-Mexican border. My mom's actually from Mexico and came to the U.S. at the age of 17. And my dad is first-generation American, and his family's also from Mexico. So I went from a community that's like 85% Mexican-American to DePauw University, which is very different than that. I say that's when I met white America. I came to understand how different I was. I didn't realize I was Mexican-American until I went to DePauw. And at the time, it was 3% Latino, 5% Black, and white, and then just very upper middle class students. And so just the adjustment of that, both just culturally, and I had no network in Indiana, and I literally traveled by myself with 3 pieces of luggage and showed up to Greencastle, Indiana. And so that adjustment was real, and values, norms, foods, things that are just normal to me were just not to everybody else around me. But the hardest part was actually not being academically prepared. I was a top kid at my high school. We place core members where I went to elementary, middle, and high school. Top kid, student body president, all-star basketball player. I still have the scoring record at my high school, by the way. And I'm the kid that you would bet on, like, that she's gonna be great. And I suddenly found myself in a position where I wasn't winning, and I liked winning, and I knew what winning felt like. But I realized I just hadn't had the access and opportunities that the people around me had, and I did very poorly my first semester. But I kept at it, tough love from my mom, who's like, well, rather than complaining, you should go back and study and get off the phone. And you're like, oh God, Mom, you have no idea. And I ended up doing well my second semester, and then I ended up doing really well. But what I learned was, of course I was capable, and of course I could do it. I just had to figure out, how to adjust. But that led me to think, hey, there's lots of kids where I grew up, and I was the top kid in my high school. What's going on with all the other kids, and that's what actually drew me to Teach for America. I was on a path to being a lawyer. That's what I thought I wanted to be, and I joined TFA, and my mom was mortified by it. Yeah.
So I've interviewed more than 500 CEOs by now. One of my favorite questions is, tell me how your parents have influenced your leadership style.
Yeah. Well, my mom is fierce. My mom, when she's very disciplined and goal-oriented, and she works really hard. And so does my dad. But my mom has had a very big influence on me. So when she got to the U.S., she, learned English herself, and she got a job, and she had mostly a minimum wage job her entire career. She was a florist at a grocery store, but she was the best florist there was, highest, sales. And she just never made excuses. She just was like, you do with what you got and you go for it. And that's how we were raised, and there's no complaining. And my dad's a big no complainer and a big, I don't care what you do with your life, but have integrity and do it, be the best. And so that really is how we oriented, which leads to, I'm pretty competitive and very focused. And I just think you just gotta work until you figure it out and not give up.
Yeah, that's great. So let's shift to TFAs. So how many applicants do you typically have for your core member positions in a given year?
Yeah, so last year we had 37,000 applications. This year we just closed our season, and we haven't even announced this publicly, but I'll say we're right under 49,000 applications. Wow. Yeah. So, which is awesome. And the diversity of our application pool is incredible, which is about 50% people of color. So we really have a great, robust pool.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you more about that in a few minutes. So you've got your pick. You've got this great applicant pool.
Yeah.
Let's go deep on what qualities you're looking for and how do you figure out if they have those? Because one of the things that fascinates me about TFA is that you are taking pretty young people.
Yeah.
Who don't have a ton of living. It's not like their resume is 3 pages long like a senior executive.
Yeah.
Taking young people and very quickly putting them into, let's face it, like one of the toughest situations you can imagine, right? The door closes behind them, they've got kids, maybe books, maybe a curriculum, maybe not, and they've got to figure it out. So that's a tough casting call. How do you figure out who's got the right stuff?
Yeah. When you say it that way, it sounds really hard. I mean, so obviously our mission is to find, develop, and support these incredible, talented folks who are going to expand educational opportunities in schools, in classrooms, in schools, and then in every sector that shapes, and really and influences the systems that schools are a part of. We start with studying our very best teachers. And so I think about we go and we observe teachers, and we of course get data on how they're doing with their students, formative assessment, summative assessment, their state data where that exists. And we go and we study them. Like, what are the skills that they have, the mindsets that they're showing? And so you can imagine one of our top classrooms feels joyful, where you feel like, gosh, there's such a connection with the teacher and the students, and we know they're able to build interpersonal skills and really connect. They really believe in their kids. Like, they really believe their kids have assets. Like, they're not entering a deficit in a community or in a classroom with students. They literally are going in saying, my kids are awesome, and I gotta figure out how to unleash that. And that really matters. They have critical thinking skills. They're able to be in the situation you describe, break down like what they're trying to do, what's the vision I'm trying to set, what's the goal, and if you have that goal, then how do you accomplish it? You need to break down the problems that you see and then figure out, how do you backwards map? How do I use data to know if my kids are learning or not? Really reflective people that just want to constantly do better and learn really matters. Interestingly enough, being organized matters. So I learn a lot when I go into a classroom on just the order of how things are going. Is there urgency? Is there enough structure with joy? And you're able to just manage all the things that you have to manage when you're a classroom teacher. And then obviously we just want folks to really be in it because they're really trying to have an impact and really doing good. So we literally go and we study these and that have persevered, like can tell us what has been hard that you have done. It's really hard to do this if you have not done hard before, right. And can really identify with that, because this is what that is. And then we study the patterns, which I just described, and then we have a model, and then we look for it when we are going through the interview process, which is really hard to do, but, you know, I think we do pretty well.
Right.
Yeah.
And being a teacher with TFA in that situation, for a lot of these people, is probably the hardest thing they've ever done.
Yeah.
Right? So you're asking them, what's the hardest thing you've done in your life?
Yeah.
And TFA is going to be 2x, 5x, 10x harder. So, you know, human beings are human beings, and we all have kind of our boiling point, right?
Totally.
And so, you know, you think somebody's going to be great, but sometimes the stress is too much, and people can't, like, I can't do this. So how do you figure that out? Or is that a roll of the dice?
Yeah, well, I mean, 88% of our folks complete their 2-year commitment, so that's high, and it's higher than the schools in which we are teaching. So we do pretty well there. I mean, we ask what's the hardest thing people have done, because at least they have a schema for understanding what do you do when things are really hard? What do you lean into? And what we want to see is, do people take personal responsibility? So, like, do they, you know, come in and take, you know, what is the locus of control that I have here? And I focus on how to solve this problem based on what I have control around, because when you're in these schools, you know, you can blame everybody around you, and if that's what you spend your time doing, you are not going to do well, because there will be a lot to complain about. So we're trying to get at things that we know are patterns that are recognizable, so that when you find yourself in them, we can draw on, like, hey, you've done this before, not the same way. It is still the hardest thing I've ever done, teach, in any other job I've been in. But you can remember what that was. And I think that's what we're trying to get at, because then you have a reference point. And just being able to articulate that process is important. Right. And some people can't, and they don't get, you know, it's really, and that's a clear screening. So I think overall it matters. And there's not, you know, our model is not like, oh, if you have this and you don't have anything else, you get in. So it's a combination of all these things that we have come to realize really matters.
Right.
Yeah.
So I always ask the CEOs I interview, how do you hire? What questions do you ask? And what fascinates me is that to this day, I'm still hearing job interview questions that I've never heard before, which at some level, as I've reflected on it, makes sense, because by the time somebody gets to the CEO in corporate America, that person has been scripted and coached and trained. You know, they know all the right answers. My biggest weakness is I care too much. You know, things like that. Or
I'm the worst answer.
You know,
I work too much.
Yeah, yeah. And the CEOs say it's just elevator music after a while. So they have to, out of necessity, develop what I call bank shot questions, right? How do you get around somebody's polished facade to find out what they're really like? So I'm a little geeky about this. The dinner party game I just play in my own head is if you could only ask somebody one question in a job interview, and you had to decide based on their answer whether or not to hire them.
Oh, wow.
What would your question be?
What is the biggest mistake you've ever made?
And what percentage of the time do people try and give it that sort of top spin of my biggest weakness is I care too much? Yeah.
And you just say, that's not a good answer. I need you to try again.
Right. What would be your...
And what I'm trying to do is obviously get at them being honest and really being able to reflect on a really hard thing that they got wrong. And being able to then just, and then I want to hear the process. So why did you get it wrong? You know, like, did someone tell you should do it one way, but you did it another way? What did you consider when you were doing that? You know, and being able to just reflect through that process. You learn a lot about just the person and how they operate and how these attributes of personal responsibility and reflection, which I think really matters.
Yeah. So I've heard some weird job interview questions over the years from CEOs. Like, if there were no humans on the planet, only animals, what kind of animal would you be and why?
Are you asking me that question?
I am asking you that.
Like, oh my gosh, this is, okay, if there were no humans, I would be a dog.
What kind of dog?
I would be Han, which is my dog right now, who's like the perfect dog. She's a mutt, she's a shepherd and a lab, and she's mixed, and I think it's like, you know, there's lots of assumptions about mutts, and she's the most perfect. She gets to be who she is, and she's incredibly loyal and just She is really my best friend, my little gal. She's the only girl in my family. I have a husband and 4 boys that
need to
in my
balance.
house.
So
Han and I rely on each other a lot.
That's great. I have to tell you, I have heard some weird answers to that question over the years. People make up animals, animals I've never heard before. The other, one of my favorite job interview questions, which I'm not going to put you on the spot.
Thank you.
Is what are the qualities of your parents do you like the least and the most? And I always say there's an entire industry built around that question. It's called therapy, right? Anyways, so we won't go there. What do you, in your opinion, what is the highest possible rate of successful hiring? Because nobody has a perfect track record in hiring,
gosh, yeah.
right? We build these models, the data, people are more complicated than the frameworks we put around it. How good can hiring be?
I think it's really hard, and obviously there's always some. It's never going to be a perfect science, but I do think there's good science that helps in predictability. I mean, I think at TFA we get it right 85–90% of the time. Like I really do, and we're constantly reflecting on our model. So every year, I mean, we are going out and we have evolved it as a result when we start to realize like, oh, I mean, for example, we didn't always have a focus on ensuring that our core members or the prospects had some just real experience in low-income communities, which means like you grew up in a low-income community or you've actually really authentically been engaged in a low-income community. So tutoring, mentoring, just something where the first time you go to a low-income community is not when you join Teach for America. It just, as it turns out, that's really, really, really tough. And so that wasn't always, I mean, that we just added that probably 4 or 5 years ago as a thing to pay attention to and is in our model now, which turns out to really matter. And so we're constantly, you know, trying to refine and, you know, and as we define what great teaching is and what that means, you know, we go back at it, which has evolved over time and how we think about success.
Right. And to be a core member at TFA, you have to be the kind of person who has a healthy relationship with failure. Do you see that as a challenge with some of your recruits?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you have to have a healthy relationship with failure because our people do not have a healthy relationship with failure.
They don't like it, but you know, some people, we read a lot about this.
Yes.
Right? You know, people, they feel this pressure to lead these perfect lives. So
Absolutely.
when they don't get the A, you know, they crumble. So do you see that
Oh, it's so tough. I mean, a lot of our folks do, in fact, this is the first time a lot of our folks really fail. Like they are like, I am failing, and it is a hard thing to cope with. And when it's the first time you're dealing with like really feeling like you are failing, and the stakes are so high and the responsibility is so big, and your own like, and the expectations we have of you, like we just say, yeah, we know. Yeah, we know. I mean, I walked into a classroom, and I was telling you earlier, with 36 first graders, 30 desks, and no books and no curriculum. And my kids didn't know their letters. And you're just like, okay. I mean, I remember having to break down my classroom 3rd month in school. I was trying to do centers, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to ruin my kids' lives if I don't figure this out, and started crying. It was very unproductive. But, you know, you just feel so much pressure. So, and I had failed. I had that feeling of failure before. So we work really hard to normalize it, like normalize, like this is part of the process. And, you know, we even show a chart to our teachers that says, you know, you start and you're on fire and you think you can conquer anything, and you are going to hit rock bottom about October or November. Like you really are going to hate your life. You're going to think this is the biggest mistake you've ever made to do this, and you're going to be watching your peers who've gone on to do all these other lucrative things, and you're going to be like, what was I thinking? And you cannot quit. Like you've got to lean on each other and understand so many people are depending on you now. It's all about you, and it's not about you, and we've got to come together and support each other. And the good news that I get to say now is we have, you know, 46,000 people that have done this before you, so it's not an impossible challenge. Like, we actually see what's possible. You can be successful as a 1st and 2nd year teacher. It's really hard, and we're going to do this together. And so trying to just show the predictability of how tough it really is and how normal it is to go through that, and then trying to take our core to take real responsibility of each other to help each other get through that.
Right. So let's talk about analytics and teacher performance. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a little bit of an industrial complex built around measuring the performance of TFA teachers compared to non-TFA teachers. It seems like
we are the most studied organization
Yes.
for teachers out there,
Exactly.
yes.
So what are your observations on when people do it right, when they do it wrong? Are they measuring the wrong things? Without criticizing your critics or your people who study you, I mean, what is, being on the receiving end of all these studies, what do you see people do right and wrong?
And how they're analyzing our own
Yeah.
performance and
Yeah.
how our teachers do. Well, I think a lot of people, I mean, we have our own third-party studies that sort of validate our work every year, where there are states that actually measure performance of teachers and student outcomes, and have teacher prep programs, and then how students and teachers are doing with you know, in the classroom. Our teachers do very well. They're, you know, amongst the highest performing teachers in the state when it comes to first-year teachers. And so we have that data. So that is what I do know, I understand. I know my retention data. The things that we get critiqued about is not so much that, well, two things. Inputs, like, you know, when I describe what TFA does, how is it so that it is responsible to take 22-year-olds on average, who are mostly not education majors, 85% of the folks who join us had no intention of ever going into education, into the hardest, toughest schools in our country, in urban and rural America. You do 5 weeks of training, and then you put them in the classroom, and they're fully responsible. That it seems irresponsible and not like the right thing to do. I hear that a lot. And so they cannot be effective as a result. Well, our studies show otherwise, and it is true, like that is our model. I mean, we do focus a lot on recruitment. I mean, we have a very selective process, which most other teacher preparations do not have. And then we do the training and we do the support. A lot of also teacher prep programs don't focus on the support, and that is how our model goes. The second thing is that our teachers aren't much better than other first-year teachers, and that is actually true. Except in certain subject areas like math and early ed. What you see is you see the benefit. The second-year teachers, our teachers get a lot better. The third year, they're much better. And fourth year, for those that stay in the classroom. But we're also producing leaders. Like, they're social entrepreneurs. And Fortune 30 under 30, 25% of those folks that get named every year are TFA alums. You know, they've started the highest performing charter schools in America, and today are run by TFA alums. We have, you know, Teachers of the Year in Texas. Ashley just got named Teacher of the Year, and she's a TFA alum. So you just see the impact of folks' leadership over time. Over 100 folks are in elected office, and, you know, the fastest performing system in America, Washington, D.C., you look at that, and it's a TFA story. And so you see the leadership of what happens over time, but that's one of the critiques that we do get.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about diversity all day long.
Yep.
How do you think about that? It's a sort of open-ended question, but I know you make it real with your data, but what's your philosophy?
Well, I would say diversity, equity, and inclusiveness is just so central to how we think about our work. And the reason for that is when we think about the problem that exists, like, why does educational inequity exist? Obviously, you know, kids are going to schools with so many needs, and our schools are not designed to meet their needs. But also, like, people don't expect our kids to do well. There is, you know, institutional racism and classism in our schools, and race really matters. And so for us, and we're teaching predominantly kids of color and kids from low-income communities, and so I don't think there's a way to do this work responsibly without a focus on that. 50% of kids in public schools today are kids of color. 82% of the workforce is white. 82% of the teachers in America are white. And that just really matters. And so for us, we think that it's important to recruit a broad coalition of folks. So we for sure need people who come from all walks of life, can reach truly every dinner table in America. But we do put a special focus on people of color and people from low-income communities, because we think we should be reflecting our students and communities, and those voices should really be helping shaping and influencing the direction that we go, because any systems change that happens has to be led by those, or has to be shaped by those who have been themselves impacted by it, but also led by those who have personal proximity to the issue, understand the complexity of it, and we think that'll lead to the greatest outcomes, which is why we focus on a broad and diverse coalition. We focus a lot on cultural competence and culturally relevant teaching, because we think that's just really important in our approach in teaching in the classrooms that we do.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love to talk about how you use data to evaluate teacher effectiveness. And I know there are different schools of thought, different approaches. My wife's been a teacher for 25 years, so I've heard about a lot of these different frameworks. What do you find the best strategy to find out if a teacher is good?
Yeah. Well, this is such a hard question, because there is not national data that we can just pull from. There are no systems or standards that all talk to each other, and so this is actually very challenging for us. So we have to focus on the teacher level, our regions that then are figuring out at the state what kind of data they can get. But in terms of like what is effective teaching, what kind of data we're trying to get, we know that we're trying to ensure that our teachers have formative and summative assessments so that they understand how their students are doing. We also, and when we define success as, of course, student achievement, but also other things like character building is really important. And how do you measure that? We also think our core members should be focused on access and opportunity to kids. Our kids often do not have just access to the world, and we think that we need to make sure that we're talking to families and their families and them about what they want to do, and ensuring that they understand the pathways to get there. The new thing that we're trying is student surveys alongside actual student achievement data that we are seeing correlates with each other. But the student achievement survey is asking, what do you like about your teacher? Do you feel valued and affirmed? Do you think your teacher likes you? So it gives you just really interesting data too on how the teacher is doing that is showing to correlate with student achievement data as well. Right. Yeah.
And let's focus inside TFA. You're going through a fairly big upheaval in terms of how you're running TFA.
Well, so we went through a phase of incredible growth. I mean, we grew at an 18% compound annual growth rate for like 13 years straight, and we got to scale, which is incredible. And so we have 53,000 core members and alumni, and we're in 53 communities, and we are no longer growing. And so the question becomes, and we built an infrastructure that was growing, and we did a lot of command and control from the center out to the regions. And what we've learned is, this work is obviously in communities. Our communities are very different, and so what we need in Philadelphia is quite different than the needs in the Rio Grande Valley. And we need to make sure that we're approaching the work from a community level, like what's the vision of this community? How does TFA contribute to it? And in order to do that, we've worked to just decentralize the organization a lot. We're still one organization, and we still have one 501c3, but really believe that decision-making needs to be pushed down to closest to the community, which means you just have to have a different kind of infrastructure. And we also are working to create an infrastructure of learning where, we know innovation has to be happening. We really believe that's the next, phase of impact in terms of how we're training and supporting our teachers, and want to give that freedom to our regions. And so we're working in infrastructure to study those things, know if it's working, share, codify insights, learnings, have a knowledge management system, which is very hard to do, but that people are able to actually learn from each other and accelerate progress in that way. So making that change is a really big deal. We came up with this strategy, announced it last spring it was, and I wanted to flatten the organization too and just be more agile. The world around us is changing, so it led to some just big changes that we're still working through. But things are moving in the right direction.
And I'm curious, when did you start thinking that you could be CEO and that you'd want to be CEO?
I never had the thought that I wanted to be the CEO until Ms. Kopp came to talk to me about it. Yeah, so I'm a mother of 4 children, and I'm like, my first priority is to be a good mom and a good wife. And so, that was a lot of my hesitation, you know, was this the right timing? Do I want to do this? And I probably had never really seen myself as the CEO. And so it was when Wendy came to talk to me, and it took me a while to process and convince myself this was a good idea.
Right.
But I'm glad I did it.
And what has been the biggest surprise of doing the job? I mean, you probably had a theory of what the job was going to be like, but the actually doing the job, were there any surprises, even small ones?
I love convincing people that this is a good thing to invest in and be a part of. And I will admit, I mean, I did fundraising when I was our executive director in the Rio Grande Valley, and I had forgotten what that felt like, because my job before this as chief operating officer was I was the co-CEO too, so it went chief, okay. But as the chief operating officer, I was very internal, and I was just managing. I mean, we were managing quality and trying to grow, and that was my job we were just managing the heck out of the system to get the results we needed. So I wasn't doing much of the external stuff, and that was actually one of my big hesitations, like, well, I really like that. I mean, I get to sit in incredible rooms with incredible people, and I just didn't think that would be the thing I would like, and I actually like it.
Good.
Yeah, and get lots of energy, and I think it's more of the people. I'm interested and curious about people's lives, and you know, and then their investments in TFA and why, and trying to get people to think it's a good idea.
That's good. And have you had any of those CEO moments, like if you say you like green tea, suddenly people are bringing you green tea every 5 minutes? Or?
People know that I love coffee, so everywhere I go, I walk into an office, they're like, hey, Elisa, here's an Americano. And I'm like, oh, it's so nice, actually. It's so nice, yeah.
So you said your favorite job interview question is, what's the biggest mistake you've ever made, and what did you do about it? Mm-hmm. And how would you answer that?
Oh, gosh, darn it. Oh, gosh, what's the biggest mistake I've ever made? That's a really hard question.
Do you want me to ask you some of my other favorite ones?
No, I don't. You're going to ask me about a dog or an animal, and I don't want to answer that question.
I could do this stuff all day long.
I think, well, I don't know if it's the biggest mistake. This is what I'm grappling with. How big does big? Because I want to be honest, and I don't like not being honest.
You can say getting on the stage with me.
You know, I guess I would say, so, okay, I have a good one. When Matt and I became co-CEOs, we did a listening tour, and we'd both been in the organization for a long time and thought, let's just like go and listen to people. And we have lots of data about how things are going. And it actually led to a change that we had. But we were realizing internally, meaning with our staff, our core members, and our alumni, that there was lots of questions and discomfort. People were asking, like, are we having an impact? Or like, should TFA change? Like, should we be having a 3-year commitment, a 4-year commitment? We were at the height of our diversity work, and so there were just lots of questions about what we were trying to accomplish. And the biggest mistake I would say that we made is we didn't act fast enough to like answer the questions, have a clear plan. So we had abandoned our strategic plan like 2 years before that. And we were still on a growth plan, but it was not right. Like, people were not buying it. The satisfaction of our core members and our alumni started to decrease, and we knew that was bad, but we didn't say, hey, like, that's really, really bad, and it ended up being something that is a really big deal. And we weren't paying attention enough, but we knew growing wasn't right. People didn't think we should be growing. We should like really just bring it back in, reevaluate what was going on, but we continued to persist. And our organization, our community needed us to come out with conviction and clarity on what we were doing and where we were going and why, and what we thought about these big questions people were asking. And we actually waited, and part of it is the co-leadership. Like, I don't know if co-leadership is a good or bad idea, but when you're in the middle of lots of change and realizing there's lots of conflict, it's a bad idea, because someone needs to just take charge and lead and move it forward and have full responsibility for it. And we didn't do that. And that led to lots of, unfortunate just bumps and more bumps and more bumps, and you know, and then you have to fix it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can I ask you my one last favorite job? It's not a put you on the spot
I'm like,
question.
okay.
No, it's not like a curveball or something. So I love this question. What is your natural strength? It's not what you studied in college, it's not what's on your business card, but what comes so easily to you that it's as natural as breathing? So somebody might look at you do that and go, how did you do that so quickly? Another way to think about it is, what are you in the top 5% in the world at? What is your superpower? What is your top
Superpower.
your top ninja skill? How would you answer that?
I would say, I think it's something about creating an environment of trust, warmth, that then leads to my ability to motivate people to get things done.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
We could talk all night, but please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.
Thanking this,
Thank you, Adam.
yeah, that's great.